Rafah. The IDF says a number of suspects ignored warning shots. Britain's biggest water firm says it's looking at alternative plans to raise money after a potential takeover deal collapsed. A US firm decided not to invest in Thames Water. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 12 points at 87.87. The pound buys $1.35 and €1.18. LBC weather, mainly dry for much of the UK tonight. Showers in Scotland, especially in the west and far north. A low of 3 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Matt Hewitt.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 8:02 on LBC. It's Tuesday's Cross Question. I think we're going to have a good one tonight. I've got a really good panel. I'm sure you've got some really good questions to ask them. Joining me tonight on my right, Sir Alex Shelbrooke, Conservative MP for Wetherby and Easingwold. We have Poppy Coburn, Deputy Comment Editor of the Daily Telegraph. To my left, Melissa Benn, journalist, writer and activist and editor of a new book called The Most Dangerous Man in Britain, ? We'll reveal who that might have been in just a moment. And next to her, Tom Hayes, the Labour MP for Bournemouth East. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need if you'd like to ask our panel a question. You can WhatsApp us on that number. Text 84850. You can say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And you can watch us on Global Player and the LBC app.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's take our first question. It's from Robbie in Chelmsford. Robbie, hi.
Good evening, all. My question is this. Will there actually be any punishment and accountability for the egregious failures at Thames Water, or will we taxpayers just be asked to pick up the bill as usual?
You old cynic, Robbie. Let's go to Tom Hayes.
Well, clearly Thames Water is a worry. We need to have a water network and system that is fit for purpose. And the Secretary of State today in the House of Commons was saying that the government stands ready to step in under any eventuality, that there should be no concern about disruptions to water supply. We obviously have the review which has recommended that Ofwat might take a more narrowly focused approach towards certain water companies if they are seen to be behaving improperly, and we will take that into view as we move forward with further reform of the water industry. But I think the thing to say, which gets to the question really, is that very early on in the life of this Parliament, soon after the election of the government, we brought forward a water bill whose intent was to make it a criminal offence for polluting bosses and to make sure that they aren't able to take their bonuses and that the water industry plays its fair share in our society. And I think that's really important. And in the case of Thames Water, we have a company which has been pumping sewage into our waters for 300,000 hours last year, crumbling under a £20 billion debt, and we need to make sure that Thames Water is fit for purpose.
KKR, the American private equity company, they have said today that one of the reasons that they've decided not to go ahead with this $4 billion investment is because of the anti-water industry comments made by Steve Reed, the Environment Secretary. Now, I don't think it can entirely be down to that. I would make that clear. But it is quite interesting that seems to be, well, that to be fair, they haven't said that themselves. That is, it's been briefed to industry journalists that that's the case. If this £4 billion cannot be found from elsewhere, inevitably there's going to have to be some sort of government rescue, isn't there?
Well, the Secretary of State was saying today in the House of Commons that there is still a market solution which is available. And that particular allegation, I think, is a bit unfounded. It was something that was used by the Conservatives in the House of Commons today. I make no apology, nor does the government, for calling out the bad behaviour of water companies like Thames Water. And I think it's improper of that company to be basically saying, as it did, that the government ought not to be calling out water bosses for bad behaviour. We were elected on a manifesto which promised strong action against polluting bosses and bad companies. And this is what the public want. I represent Bournemouth East, which is a coastal seat. Water is a huge issue, and people want to see the action that we've taken forward.
OK, Alex Shelbrooke.
Well, think, there are several issues here, aren't there, with water companies? And indeed, it became a very stark conversation about sewage going into rivers when we brought forward the Environment Bill. And up to then, there was no framework around what could be done. And then people said, you need to ban it today. And we said, well, that's not possible. And suddenly we were accused of pumping sewage into rivers. There are several things around this, but I think first of all I'd like to say is we must be very careful about how we regard utility companies. As I understand it, Iain, and I've not double-checked these figures, so I stand to be corrected, that the University Superannuation Scheme pension gets 20% of its money from dividends from Thames Water. There are a lot of pension companies invested into these utility companies because they do deliver these dividends. So I think we have to be very careful about when we say got to cut all the dividends, don't do anything else, because there's a lot of infrastructure in terms of financial systems set up around them. And that makes things not quite as simple as they should seem. I think there's another problem as well. And I think that one of the reasons that we have such overflows of sewage into our water streams is because our infrastructure has never kept up with the increase in population and, more importantly, infill developments. And when you have an infill development, it just plugs into the existing system. Whereas when you have a standalone development of sort of 1,000 houses, they have to build that sewage system in place. And that's certainly been something I've witnessed around Yorkshire in my area. I have to say, Yorkshire Water, there's a lot of criticisms, but actually they've tried and they've upgraded some of the sewage works, etc., along the way. But equally, when it's the same old story when people say about we want all the sewers upgraded, I can guarantee you that the moment you start digging up swathes of my countryside around towns and villages and putting in 12 feet diameter bores, all hell's going to break loose. So there's always a disconnect in this conversation. To answer the question directly, the government, the taxpayer, is always going to be the last resort. Let's hope there is a private finance solution.
OK, Melissa Ben.
Well, can I start with a personal comment, because I'm a Thames Water customer. I don't know if everybody... Yeah. So I was looking at my bills today because I thought this would come up. And I went back to 2024 and I hadn't realised that my bill had tripled just last year, as your bill will have tripled last year.
Triple? I thought they went up by 31%.
No, mine went up. Well, maybe they've got something against me, but mine went up. Mine went up 3 times. I mean, the other thing was I had a leak in my house, and I had thought, and I think it was the case, that Thames Water used to mend leaks because it's in the interests of the company and everybody that they do it. But they said to me, no, it's at the cost of the customer. It was actually very expensive. Of course, I had to do it. And it does make me wonder about people who can't afford to mend leaks into their property. But then I was also looking up at the figures that said 40% increase in sewage, I don't think we call it disposal, but anyway, sewage release in 2024. So at the risk of sounding like the token lefty on the panel, which I think I'm here to be, I would actually like to...
We've got a Labour MP next to you. He's got a red tie on. What more do you want?
It's a lovely red tie.
OK, well, no offence to the Labour MP, who has said some very sensible things, including... I'm very pleased that the government has restricted bonuses. I think that's really important. And in a way, to answer the question from Robbie in Chelmsford, that is a kind of punishment, isn't it, to restrict bonuses and also to restrict dividends. And I take your point about complicated investment vehicles that mean that some people are benefiting from that. But I would like to see Thames Water, a public utility, taken into public ownership for the main reason is I want to see investment in the things that need to be done. Now, I'm mainly...
That was the reason they were privatised in the first place, wasn't it?
I know, but that hasn't happened. Well, I mean,
it did happen. In the first 10 years, it really did happen.
Well, it hasn't
huge
happened.
Amounts of investment.
You know, we have a lack of reservoirs in the Thames Water area, and we need those urgently. And I'm more of a listener to the...
this is where politics collides, isn't it?
Can I say, I'm more of a listener to these programmes usually than a contributor, but I've listened to so many discussions about Thames Water and the problems of dividends instead of proper investment and bonuses. I do not understand why anybody has to earn 2.3 million or whatever it is that they earn. And I therefore think we have had enough talk, and I suspect the government will end up... I mean, there's quite a difference, isn't there, between taking Thames Water into administration and nationalising it. But it's a kind. You can tell me the difference between that. But I would like to see the government take it over and do the things that we need to do.
Okay, well, from the so-called token lefty, that must make you, the token righty, but I don't even know if you are, even though you work for the Telegraph.
I'm also a Thames Water customer, so I'm not going to defend the indefensible. I also have a bottom line. But I think we have to go back to what Robbie was actually talking about, which is the question of whether or not the taxpayer is going to be asked to pick up the bill here. I was talking to a friend of mine, and he said the problem with Britain is that you have European bills and American public services. So you're paying a lot for very little. And I think Thames Water is a really good example of this. I think it's a classic case of all the worst aspects of the state and all the worst aspects of privatisation kind of mixed together, which unfortunately I think the British economy has really mastered in the last 20 years. So you mentioned the lack of reservoirs being built. Well, is that really the fault of Thames Water? They had been suggesting investment in the Abington Reservoir for 20 years. That was not blocked by greedy water sector workers. It was blocked by local planners. So we have to get back to the bottom line of what do we actually want out of this? Do we want to punish these greedy water bosses? Okay, fine. They have been greedy. They have been, I think, pretty deeply incompetent. But that is not the only reason why we have very expensive water bills in this country. So do we actually want to be blocking this private sector takeover? Do we want to be having foreign investors going, this is an unpleasant business environment, we don't want to step in? And if we don't want to, and if we are going to do that, then what is the government's plan for serious nationalisation? And can we, as Thames Water customers, actually expect to get lower bills? And I think, unfortunately, the answer to that is no, which is why people don't actually want to talk about the difficult solutions here, because they are much deeper than just corporate greed.
Can I just talk about unpleasant business environment? The reason why this company pulled out today. As soon as I heard it, I thought they don't want Fergal Sharkey on their case. I think there's a lot of criticism of Thames Water, but I think if people are not going to invest because they're afraid of a perfectly reasonable public discussion about a major public utility, well, do we want them investing?
But if they think that the government of the country is in some way against them from the start, they're not going to invest.
Well, I think Tom answered that very well. Steve Reed has made perfectly reasonable comments about the failures of Thames Water. And, I mean, are we...
But he doesn't want to nationalise it.
No, he doesn't want to, I want to.
No, Steve Reed, though, I mean, when we're talking about the position of the government, I mean, look, let's just get down to what's always been a fundamental fact. You want to nationalise it, I don't mean you personally, but I mean, if you want to have it nationalised, well, actually, you do want to have it nationalised, but I wasn't trying to be rude. But, if you want to nationalise something, okay, that's going to cost you a lot of money to do that, even if you're just buying out the debt rather than paying into the equity holders. That's going to cost you a lot of money. Where are you going to get the money from to then do the investment? I mean, the OBR, the CBI analysis of the budget this week, just on the death taxes bit, said it's going to cost the economy 1.9 billion, not raise 1.8 billion. That's a £4 billion hole just on that one subject. And that's where privatisation came in, because you were always going to spend money on the health service and on welfare before you started mending underground pipes that nobody could see. And that's the question on this. If it is nationalised and taken in, how much are we going to put water bills up by? Well, not enough if you look at it from that point of view. So what taxes are going up? Because we're seeing these demands all the time.
Yeah, but just to answer Poppy's point, you said European bills and American-style public services. I'd rather have European tax bills and European-style public services. So I would be happy to pay a bit more to have the problems that we have heard about for so long finally fixed. And I don't mean sort of post-war type nationalisation. I'm sure there are ways of doing it that are much more responsive and democratic and so on. But I'm alone on the panel.
Would you also, I mean, fine, we take it out of privatisation's hands. We could say in this instance it's been a failure. I think there's pretty strong evidence for that.
It has been.
Would you then also support deregulation of the planning system to do a massive building scheme of reservoirs when we need them, even when it's deeply politically unpopular in local constituencies?
Well, the government's already trying to take on the planning system, isn't it, with housing programmes, and it's obviously a very, very complicated business. But if you need a reservoir, you have to tackle the problems that stand in the way of it. I mean, you're a Labour MP. Do you think they'd be able to do that?
Well, I think you're right to say the government are taking planning reform really seriously. The OBR said at the time of the budget that it could unlock £7 billion of additional growth, which I think is really significant. That's better pay for people, it's more jobs for people, it's stronger communities. It's also worth remembering that we have just fairly recently seen £105 billion of investment from the private sector in our country's water industry. And that's really important because I think all the panel are agreeing that there has been a significant starvation of our water industry of investment. We've had our infrastructure crumbling and creaking, and it's now appropriate that we have that investment happening on a significant scale. In my own area, there are 2 recycling treatment centres that are having significant investments with a combined total of £200 million. I think that's happening in part because there was an anticipation of the election of a Labour government which had said it was going to get tough on water bosses. And I think over the course of this Parliament, you'll see yet more investment in our water industry. And I think that's just necessary so that people get the basics when it comes to clean drinking water, clean bathing water, and just clean water.
I think in the end, though, there was a huge amount of investment in the first decade after privatisation, and that stopped in Thames Water's case when it was bought by an Australian bank, and they basically asset stripped it. Now, that was a failure it's an awful thing to happen, but it was a failure of regulation, and the failure of the Conservative government was not to act on that and strengthen the regulator. Now, I think Steve Reed announced today the regulator was going to get more teeth, but it's kind of a bit late now because you've had this further 10 or 15 years, certainly in Thames Water's case. I don't know about the other water companies, where they didn't invest in the infrastructure in a way that they had done in the initial years after privatisation. But I'm sure we'll come back to that on the programme in the next few weeks, but we'll move on to another subject in just a moment. It's 17 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
Energy.
Cross Question with Iain Dale. Watch live on both Global Player and the new LBC app.
19 minutes past 8, Conservative MP Sir Alex Shelbrooke is with us, Melissa Benn, journalist, writer and activist, and also daughter of Tony Benn, who was...
That's one way of describing me.
I know it is, but I just want to talk about your book, and it's the way to come into that. So.
OK, so my dad, Tony Benn, was born 100 years ago this year. And so, first of all, I was asked...
So was Mrs Thatcher.
So was Mrs Thatcher. Yes. Well, the two of them, I mean, Bennism and Thatcherism are the two isms of the post-war period, actually. I mean, they both come up in different ways a lot in political conversation. I was asked to write his biography and I said, no thanks, I've got a life. But I did agree to write a foreword, quite a thoughtful foreword to a collection of his speeches and writings and talks and so on, in which I tried to appraise his life. I mean, obviously I was his daughter and he was a great dad. I loved him a lot. But I tried to stand back and see what was he trying to say? How does it look now? And actually, I was impressed. You know, when I was growing up with him, I was, growing up at home, and the reason for the title, The Most Dangerous Man in Britain, was because he was considered that. Yeah. So my
And I
teenage...
regarded him as that when I was a teenager. That was my view of him.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question?
You
Is
can
that
ask
okay?
me a question.
Politically, what do you think his greatest achievement was, and what do you think his biggest mistake was?
Why don't we start with his achievement? Because one of the reasons I wanted to write the essay that I did was because the way that he was talked about for a long time and the way the left is talked about generally is in terms of their mistakes and the disaster and all the difficulties they've brought. And I think that the left have brought some of the most interesting ideas to British politics. So that's probably my answer. I think he made socialism appealing. He presented it in a rational way. He was a tremendously energetic and interesting proponent of his ideas. His biggest mistake... Actually, it was probably, this will sound a little bit internal Labour things that may not interest everyone, was probably standing against Neil Kinnock in 1988 when the sort of momentum of the left that had built up earlier had drained away, and therefore it revealed the weakness of the left. But I think at the time we all advised him not to do it, but he did. He probably made other mistakes. You can't be in politics and not make mistakes.
Right. We could spend the rest of the programme talking about Tony Benn, but we won't. And the book is called The Most Dangerous Man in Britain.
Question mark.
I hate book titles with question marks.
Oh, will you forgive me?
Oh, I will forgive you, because I have bought the book. Okay. Poppy Coburn is here from the Telegraph, and Tom Hayes is Labour MP for Bournemouth East. Right, let's move on to a text question from Scott in West Hampstead. Mark Rutte, the Secretary-General of NATO, wants its members to increase their spending on defence, with Britain being asked to raise the percentage of GDP we spend on defence to 3.5%. If Chancellor Rachel Reeves is listening to tonight's Cross Question show, what advice would you give her for how we should pay for this increase? Alec?
Yes, I mean, I was at the NATO Parliamentary Spring Assembly last week, and on the Monday at the plenary, we always have the Secretary-General Mark Rutte spoke to us, where he made clear that what is going to happen at the Hague Summit is a request for 3.5% over the next decade to get to that point. Now, obviously, within that is some wiggle room. I think the problem is that the world is moving very, very quickly indeed. You should also not overlook the other point, which is the 1.5% of GDP on security, whether that be your secret services, whether that be internal security, cyber, etc., all of those things. These are big asks. But, if we accept that at a minimum we're back to the Cold War, and we were spending 4 or 5% of GDP then, we have to accept that that's going to be the cost of what there is a hot war going on in Europe. And I always make this point, and I don't think politicians have done themselves any favours here in this country, but that is the rub of politics, in the sense that when we talk about inflation getting to 11%, it's a political argument. It was your fault in government. Well, it was a war, and we've underplayed what's happened, and therefore I don't think people have recognised that the war in Ukraine is in every shop they go into. That inflation, it might have come down to 2-3%, but the 11% is still there. This is a direct cost of Putin's actions, and I urge anybody who has an interest in this subject to just Google Putin essay July 2021. It is akin to Mein Kampf. It's all in there. Want to expand the empire, want to unite the historic Russian-speaking people, blame an ethnic race in the Crimean Tatars, talk about the taking over of Lithuania, Eastern Poland, Belarus, all of these countries. The ambition is not stopping at Ukraine. This war could end tomorrow if Putin stopped it. So therefore, what does Europe do? Now, America do have a point that they have a serious situation forming in the Indo-Pacific. They are stretching things wide. But we are sending out the Prince of Wales to the Indo-Pacific. We're helping to support those operations. But all this comes as a cost. The one
that's the
fundamental...
That's
the aircraft carrier.
Not William.
Not Prince William, no. And you do get into a serious question when we talk about spending, is how can you spend it, when can you spend it, when you can deliver on it. And when I was at the MOD, Ben Wallace used to say, there's no point giving me 3% tomorrow. I can't spend 3% tomorrow. I have to come up up to that level. And it does take time to build ship. It does take time to build submarines. I think the Strategic Defence Review was certainly a useful document. I worry if there's any money in it at all to actually build it. The spending review comes out next Wednesday. I think we'll have some clearer answers then.
Melissa?
I'm afraid I'm going to step outside what I think is a consensus about all of this. I read the summary of George Robertson's Strategic Defence Review and also the comments by the Prime Minister and the Defence Secretary. 10 times more lethal, one of the terms used. What was Keir Starmer's term? Armoured up and battle ready. Can I ask a really naive question? Are we at war with Russia? No. I don't understand how this rhetoric has ramped up. Putin invaded Ukraine. Terrible thing. Europe is helping Ukraine without entering into a war with Russia. I think we have to look at Trump's role, which has been deeply, deeply unhelpful and muddled. I can understand us wanting to contribute more to NATO's overall budget because America has pulled out of the whole post-war agreement that it's going to help fund peace in Europe. But there's something about the discussion now. It does frighten me, the way that we are talking more and more about war. We've got more of a military language. And of course, the other purpose that it serves is because we're so worried about growth, now defence is becoming an area for the nation's growth. So, thousands of jobs to build all these sort of aircrafts and submarines and so on. If you're interested in history, as I am, you look back at the First World War, where countries slept walk into the most catastrophic conflict where millions of people were killed. The Second World War was a different case because it was a just war against an appalling Nazi government. But I worry that we are playing our own part, even with the best will in the world, towards careering towards a catastrophic conflict. And can I just mention one more thing, which is I heard Jeremy Hunt on the radio today. He's written a book called Make Britain Great Again.
Can we make Britain great again? Another question mark title.
Another question mark. So you can tell him off about that.
I've got him on the programme on Thursday.
But he said a really interesting thing, which is if you look at all the UN markers of what makes a country, of who has influence in the world, the UK is in the top 10 on every single marker. We have influence with other countries. We have influence with Trump. We have influence with Israel. And of course, we are still selling components for weapons that are doing the most terrible things in Gaza, and we may get onto that. I'd like to see more of that, more conversations. I don't care where they take place. I think Trump is obviously a completely unguided missile himself, so I don't know how that will work. But that's what I'd like to see us do.
Could I just answer that
very quickly?
Question? So just to say, I think, the old adage of if you want peace, be ready for war has shown itself to work. But just in terms of Trump and where things are going, one we have to add up. Everybody talks about Article 5, attack on one, attack on all. Article 5 is a reinforcement force that comes 3 weeks later. Article 3 says you must be able to defend your own borders. And European countries at this moment in time can't do that.
Poppy.
I actually think what you said, Melissa, is very interesting. And I think I probably kind of agree with you to a certain extent, but for different reasons. I think the rhetoric in this country around warfare is quite macho. It can sometimes be quite over the top. But I don't think that reflects militarism. I think that reflects weakness. I think some of the conversations we've been having over the war in Ukraine, Ben Wallace, when he was Defence Minister, coming out and saying this is evidence that the peace dividend is now over, we have to change our mindset. What did Europe actually do until Trump started wading into the middle of things, smashing things about, causing a lot of upset? Well, nothing. We didn't actually act like the peace dividend had ended. We talked a lot of big talk. We gave some money, yes, but we never actually gave enough to help Ukraine win the war. We always just gave them just enough to keep the conflict going on, which obviously kept Russia engaged in the battle, but again, a massive cost of human life. I think the thing that we're not willing to accept in this country is we are going to have to make a choice, warfare or welfare. that is going to have a big spending implications. And to go back to the question, if I was Rachel Reeves and someone asked me this question, I'd ask for a bottle of whiskey, because there are no pleasant answers to this. The fact of the matter is that Britain is currently basically incapable of fighting any kind of hot war. So I think the rhetoric is something we use to make ourselves feel better about our position when we are actually quite weak. And that is something that Putin is quite aware of. And that's why this has been such a distressing conflict. When America has now made clear under Trump that it's no longer interested in what's going on in the European continent, it said, you have to pay for yourselves. What has our response been? I don't think it's been urgency. I think it's been people fiddling at the margins, trying to cut a little bit there, maybe spend a little bit there. There's been no real change of thinking on the European continent, and that includes the UK.
Okay. Tom Hayes.
I think I would put this discussion into two timeframes. The first is the more immediate, and the second is the longer term. If you look at the US national security strategies of Joe Biden, of Trump before him, and the foreign policy behaviour of Obama before Trump, it was clear there was a distancing of the US from the defence of Europe. Whether it was with Obama pivoting towards Asia, whether it was Trump feeling like bandwagoning and free riding was inappropriate, and Joe Biden cementing that, and Trump now putting it on steroids. So I think we need to realise this is part of a longer-term historical drift, which was not addressed by the last Conservative government. I say that not as an attack, just as an observation. I think actually, until you take a step into this moment to look back on what's happened, you don't realise just how seismic a shift has been happening over that period of time. And if you look right now, this is where I disagree with Poppy. I think actually with the inauguration of Donald Trump in January and the few months that have passed, you've clearly seen a transformed world landscape to which Britain has to respond. And I think with the agreement to move to 2.5% by identifying how you spend the money and how you raise the money, and then with the announcement of the SDR this week, which is a very effective overview of our strategic security landscape, from which more will follow in the comprehensive spending review, I think you have a government which is showing the necessary urgency.
But isn't it odd to announce, well, we have an ambition to get to 3% the day before NATO is demanding 3.5%? There's something not quite joined up there.
Well, there's been a call in the House of Commons for some time now to bring the Strategic Defence Review forward, as is appropriate. And it was important that it came forward at the right moment with all the necessary work done and the consultation being considered and all the responses brought into that document. And I think the resulting strategic review is a strong piece of work. And the commitments within it are really good. I think we also need to recognise that while I'm not criticising the Conservatives around their strategic insight into the shifting priorities of the United States, we do have to recognise that there has been a degradation of our armed forces across all of the key services for a very long time. And so we have to move quickly to restore our armed forces to some level of operational ability. The last point I'd make on this is the Prime Minister sees far more intelligence than we all do around this table. He will be seeing things about the threat that Russia and other countries pose. And I would expect that he is coming forward with this urgency and in this form.
You see, just on that, I used to deploy that argument about Iraq. And I'd go on programmes like this and say, oh, well, I believe my Prime Minister when he says there are weapons of mass destruction. Because if I don't believe my Prime Minister, everything crumbles. And I think a lot of people are going to question what you just said there because they've lost total trust in their country's leaders over this sort of thing.
Well, let me come back on that point, if I may. I don't think that is something which stems exclusively from Iraq. I think that stems from a decade and more of people feeling utterly hopeless about politics, people promising things
Do you think that's
they
where it
can't
started?
fund. I think it's longer standing than Iraq. I think we've got a problem in our political system that goes back decades and decades about how it doesn't function and deliver, and people feeling a lack of trust for the country.
Yeah, I don't think Iraq helped, but I agree with you that I think it's deeper and wider than that. It's not that I don't believe Keir Starmer I don't believe the point you're making about Keir Starmer. It's just that there's no answer to that, is there? We're not the Prime Minister, so it immediately renders those who are uneasy about things and uneasy about all of this helpless or pointless.
Right, we're 5 minutes beyond where we should be for the news, so with respect, I'm going to stop the discussion there because we do need to go to the news headlines at 8:35 on LBC. Matt Hewitt is here with the headlines.
The Defence Secretary is refusing to confirm whether the government will raise taxes to cover increases in defence spending. It's understood the UK will be forced at a NATO summit this month to raise its contribution to 3.5% of national output to keep the US on side. The United Nations has called for an immediate, independent investigation into reports 27 people have been killed outside an aid centre in Gaza. Israel claims it fired warning shots, but some suspects failed to retreat. And search teams have an area of the Algarve on lockdown as the renewed search for Madeleine McCann ends its first day. She was 3 when she disappeared in 2007. LBC weather. Blustery showers tonight in the north and west of the UK. Patchy cloud elsewhere. Lows of 4 to 10 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
No relation to Patrick.
So Alex Shelbrook, Melissa Benn, Tom Hayes and Poppy Goburn here taking your questions. The next one comes from Anthony in Blackpool. Good evening, Anthony. What would you like to ask?
Yeah, good evening. Contested shootings of Palestinians.
Sorry, can you start again? You cut off there.
Sorry, I thought that. Yeah, regarding the recent reports of shootings of Palestinians near a food supply base, I'd like to ask the panel, how can we ensure that food does reach people who need it? And finally, how does the panel respond to the reports of these purported shootings?
Now, the Gazan Health Ministry, which of course is run by Hamas, has said that 27 people were killed when shots were fired by Israeli forces as people waited for aid to be distributed. The IDF has confirmed that its forces opened fire, but insisted that this was only at people moving towards them in a potentially threatening manner. Melissa Benn.
I've been following the discussions and reports about these incidents over the last 2 days. I, like many people, think the problem lies with the American-Israeli form of distribution, where they're asking people to come to one of 4 hubs. I think that means that only those who are not too weak to walk can do it. People are obviously extremely hungry. As far as I can tell, although there are no international journalists in Gaza, these reports are accurate. I think the UN think that 62 people have been killed since Sunday. The answer must be to allow the UN to implement their food distribution programme, which is done very differently. It takes it to where people are. So I find this latest set of incidents just another example of something truly terrible going on.
There is footage that I've seen that shows Hamas gunmen sort of approaching crowds, and there was another piece of footage I saw when a body was being carried away and the people carrying the body away were chanting anti-Hamas slogans. Now, I don't know what to read into that, but I mean that has to form part of the story, doesn't it?
This is a territory of of hundreds of thousands of people who have been bombed, now being starved. It's just the most terrible, terrible story. And it will only end when America stops supporting Israel. Okay. And when we stop supporting Israel in what they're doing now, and stop supporting the right-wing elements of the government who are in control. And I think, to go back to Jeremy Hunt, we have a role in influencing that. And David Lammy did last week with France and Canada. The three countries stood up and said enough. But that's too little, too late.
But some would argue that by doing that, and in the kind of emotional way that he did that, it will have pleased a lot of people, but it will have meant that we have less influence with Israel.
David Lammy is an emotional politician. That's just his style. I think... Personally, I think that the international mood is shifting against Israel now. And I don't know if you ever hear those discussions and whether you have them on LBC between official IDF and government spokespeople and journalists who are trying to get accurate information. But they are very, very testy and difficult discussions. I've done them yourself.
I've interviewed them myself. And you are right. But I think they get testy because, in part, they know that the international community has become more hostile.
And why have they become more hostile?
Well, we can have that debate.
Well, I think we know why.
Tom Hayes.
I think anybody who's staring at their TV screens and seeing the suffering of civilians, the starvation that's been happening, the blocking of aid and food, and the resulting death and destruction that has hit Gaza for months on end, will feel very human feelings, which is empathy, compassion, and a desire to support. And that's what you're seeing from the government. By joining together with France and Canada in a united stance, by suspending the free trade negotiations with Israel, the UK has made very clear that it finds the behaviour of Israel militarily towards Gaza as intolerable, unacceptable. And I think all of Parliament, I hope, would stand behind that view.
Poppy.
I think the reason why Israel decided not to use the United Nations in the distribution of this aid, and the reason that they've given is that there were concerns about the infiltration of Hamas into the United Nations, which I think is a valid concern when you're obviously fighting a terrorist group. Although you do see the problems with this strategy, I think, when these tragedies occur, because humanitarian aid cannot be used as a tool in a military operation. And unfortunately, that is what is currently happening. As you pointed out, Melissa, it being used only in certain zones. I understand the desire to essentially starve out Hamas, to not allow that food to be looted by Hamas. And they have been looting these aid trucks that have been coming in previously. But at what human cost? And I think that is why it is important for people who consider themselves to be friends of Israel in the international community do push back when there are instances which will only cause more people to turn around away from their genuinely righteous war against a terror group. And we can bring up the fact that this is still because the hostages have not been fully released, but that cannot be at the cost of this intense humanitarian suffering in the Gaza Strip, which achieves nothing.
Okay, let's go to Alec.
Yes, I mean, look, let's start off by saying is that the consequence of what Hamas did on the 7th of October, when they massacred more Jews in one day than since the Holocaust, and the subsequent war has led to hundreds of thousands of innocent people suffering horrendously. And I'm sure there isn't a single person who doesn't think that that's an awful thing. I think Poppy is right in that we've got the reports of bread being sold for $400 a loaf, trying to raise money for Hamas. You're dealing with a terrorist organisation. I mean, President Reagan said back in 1982, I think it was about Prime Minister Bennett at the time. They can make it hard to be friends at times, and I think that where do you cross the boundary? And I think there is a genuine problem in how you get aid and support into Gaza without effectively letting Hamas take it all and let their population starve. Now, there is always a large conversation about whether war crimes are being committed or not. But I guarantee you that one war crime is hiding your fighters behind a civilian population and using civilian headquarters to launch rockets. That is a war crime on its own. And Hamas haven't done a single thing to give a jot regard to any of the lives that they purport to support, because actually they don't. All they want to do is get rid of and abolish the state of Israel. And we just have to work out, where does this end? Because if you are Israel, why would you just allow it all to rebuild from Hamas' point of view to launch the same attack again? And I do think, and I have to say, I do honestly believe that countries in the Middle East, I'm thinking of Egypt, I'm thinking of Jordan, they just haven't done enough with Hamas and Gaza and where you would expect an intervention. Everybody focuses on the West's support for Israel, but why is there no support for people in Gaza from the countries that you would say would be natural allies to them? I mean, Egypt way back were actually running the Gaza Strip. So I do think that there's other countries need to step up and help support this situation.
Okay. Melissa, you want to come back?
Just that I think there's a huge war crime in the way that Israel has punished the Palestinians for the egregious acts of Hamas. I think it is clearly a war crime. That I don't know what the thousands of numbers of people killed now. I mean, it's they've laid waste to that area. It's completely razed. And I think if journalists were allowed in, we would all perhaps have more of a sense of what's going on. But can I say something a little bit hopeful, which is that I see that on the 18th of June, Macron is holding a conference to revive the idea of the two-state solution, which was something that throughout my adulthood has been discussed a lot.
It's political virtue signalling. That's all it is on
Well,
Macron's
there's a lot
part.
to be said for virtue.
First of all, Israel doesn't want a two-state solution, and second of all, nor do Hamas, nor do many Palestinians.
Well, both of them are in a war. When people are in a war, that's absolutely right. But there are many people within Israel who are desperate at what their government is doing, and they would like to see the revival of a two-state solution.
But it's as Melissa's saying, it's about lifting our sight. It's looking towards a more positive, hopeful future. Even while it feels so grim and difficult, there has to be something that we're all working towards. The Netanyahu government has a difference with the Israeli people. They are not one and the same. Hamas and the Palestinian people are not one and the same. There are people in Gaza, there are people in Israel who want peace and to coexist and to live alongside each other. And I think the job of politicians is to hold that hope and to do all we can to work towards achieving it.
Well, it's a nice, optimistic way to end that part of the programme, but we have another 12 minutes to go, lots more questions, and including our fun question, which I know Poppy and Melissa are really looking forward to. They don't actually know about it yet. It's 8:48.
LBC Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:50 on LBC. Alex Shelbrook, Melissa Benn, Tom Hayes and Poppy Coburn here with us answering your questions. Right, here's one from James in Hitchin from WhatsApp. Is the UK's pathetic, laissez-faire attitude to drugs serving our young citizens badly when some of them seem to think drug trafficking abroad is worth the risk? Now, this is on the back of 3 British nationals from East Sussex going on trial in Indonesia, accused of smuggling cocaine into Bali in packages which disguise the drugs as Angel Delight. All 3 could face the death penalty if found guilty. Poppy.
I mean, I think in this particular instance, it's probably correct that we have essentially decriminalised at least the holding of drugs. Though I would like to push back slightly on the idea that no one tells people that smuggling drugs into foreign countries is quite a stupid thing to do.
Should they even need to be told?
I mean, it's kind of... It does feel like a lot of the conversations we have now around what we should be doing for young people is kind of, telling people how to suck eggs. Like, obviously, if you go to a different region of the world, say Dubai, it's going to have different customs, and you probably shouldn't bring the same attitude you're maybe bringing to a nightclub in London to it. And particularly when your behaviour is pretty egregiously law-breaking, as this was. I mean, I will say smuggling in Angel Delight sachets is quite creative. But yes, I think in that particular instance, there's no defending it.
Tom?
I think if you're going to another country, you obey their laws. It's as simple as that.
The media in this country is quite interesting in these cases, though, because there always seems to be a bit of sympathy with those people who are accused of this. Well, they're Brits, they can't possibly have done this, and therefore sort of Johnny Foreigner, we can't trust the court system in those countries.
Well, often the court system is very punitive. I mean, I take a slightly different view of it, having brought up young people and always saying to them when they travelled abroad to any country, don't let anybody put anything in your bag when you're going, because I'm sure that there's an element of some of these. I don't know this case, but some young people are tricked into doing it. Some young people are bullied into it. I'm afraid this is where I am at one with the media. I'm quite sympathetic to the young people, and I think to make a stupid mistake like that and then to face the death penalty or to risk long terms of imprisonment, I think that's terrible.
Okay, Alec?
Well, I'm afraid I've got sort of a bit of zero tolerance on this, which will come as a shock to everybody. But, it is blatantly breaking the law, and there is a line of suffering from one end to the other. And I think if we go back to the first part of the question, some of the biggest Class A drug taking in my city in Leeds is in the affluent villages on the outside. Cocaine seems to be used just at dinner parties, etc. We've had former cabinet ministers who were cabinet ministers at the time saying that they had used cocaine. It's not acceptable. It's just not acceptable. And quite frankly, are you really that stupid that you think you're going to get away with smuggling drugs? Because if you are,
but
then you get...
What if, as Melissa says, they might not be guilty?
I was going to come on to that point, that there is always perhaps an element of doubt, and that's where you need to use your embassy, and that's where you need people to come along who are going to give you representation and ask you some very simple questions. Ultimately, many of them have to go to court, etc., but let's not pretend they're not all being tricked accidentally. A lot of them know exactly what they're doing.
But in this particular instance, it was allegedly posting photos on Snapchat with big wads of cash, being living this gangster lifestyle. I mean, the problem is, yes, that I don't think the death penalty is warranted in this case, but I'm not in charge of Indonesia. When you leave one country's borders and you enter another, you don't get the touchy-feely liberal system anymore. And you perhaps there's a slight element of, self-preservation here. Don't post on social media that you're living a gangster lifestyle and then come crying to the British Embassy about it.
Very harsh. I would say 2 things. I'm much more critical of cabinet ministers who are taking drugs and hypocritically telling everybody not to. So I don't want to see them get the death penalty.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, actually, I think if we go back 30 years ago and some of the things that might have made headlines, for example, say David Mellor, they didn't make any headlines with Boris Johnson. And I think there comes a point there that as long as you're not preaching something and do the opposite, I don't think the public care. I don't think there's that insight to that anymore.
You're a great supporter of Boris Johnson, weren't you?
Oh, yeah, huge.
I liked you up to now, Alex.
I bet you did after the last election. The hypocrisy will get you murdered every single time.
And quite rightly. Can I just say one thing? I'm much more interested in catching and prosecuting people who are doing the whole county lines thing. That is where the damage to our communities
I actually think
Right,
it was the Chelsea show that did the greatest damage with David Mellor.
Which was apparently apocryphal.
Oh, was it?
Yeah, I was listening to Nick Ferrari was, I think, on one of the tabloids at the time, and I was listening to a podcast that he was doing, Beeb Watch, and he was explaining about how all this happened, and shall we say they spiced up the front page a little bit. And I don't think there was any toe-sucking either. But on that controversial note, let's go to Tara in Lewisham. Hello, Tara.
Hello. Thank you for a most interesting conversation. Just one question, which I think all of us.
Can you speak up, Tara? You're very difficult to hear.
I'm so sorry. Is that better?
Yes.
Given that all prime ministers recently have all gone back on their word, U-turned, I'm wondering how the general public can regain faith in politics.
This is thank you, Tara from Outer Mongolia. This is a refrain that we hear a lot on this station about how can trust be rebuilt in politics when you have a succession of prime ministers going back not only on policies but on things that they promised in the past. There's no simple answer to this, but if you can give it in 45 seconds each, that would be appreciated. Tom?
I think it's a virtue that the Prime Minister is listening to his Labour MPs who are out on their doorsteps week after week after week, hearing what people have to say about where the winter fuel payment threshold was drawn, feeding that back, and then saying, actually, you've got a point.
But he's U-turned on virtually everything he said in his leadership campaign, hasn't he?
Well, I'd reject that. I think it's a mark of the health of our democracy, genuinely, that we have a Prime Minister which is saying, we're going to revisit this, the economy is growing, we're in a better situation, let's try and make this situation better for those who are just missing out. That's something I've been saying to the government, is something other Labour MPs have been. I think that's how you have a grown-up, serious, functioning democracy.
Alec?
Well, I think you have to get away from populism. I mean, populism will always win you one election, and you'll never deliver.
You had that conversation with Robert Jenrick recently.
Populism will only deliver you one election, and then you won't deliver it because most of it's claptrap, and then you'll go to the next party who's offering that populism, and therefore there'll just be that constant cycle of disappointment. And I think actually why this has become so prevalent is because of social media creating an algorithm and bringing similar thinking people together in one area. But, you know, there was nothing populist about the Thatcher government in the first 5 or 6 years. There really wasn't. But she had the vision of where she wanted to take the country, and for the reasons it did. Now, I'm sure we could debate that all night long about where Thatcherism took the country. We can't, because
we're running out of time.
But it wasn't populism.
You know what? The reason we get populism is because politicians don't do things that are popular. And I understand sometimes you've got to make difficult decisions, but frankly, you'll get trust back in politicians if they do the things that people ask them to do. And I understand sometimes as a politician, you've got to drown out the media noise, you've got to get out of the 24-hour media cycle, and you've got to make difficult decisions that are going to upset people. But there are certain issues, and these are the big ones that have destroyed trust, where they just haven't decided to go ahead with it because it was difficult for them, or they disagreed.
Melissa?
I actually agree with you that I think if a Prime Minister or a leader has a genuine vision that they more or less stick to and they lay it out, that's a very important thing. But I also think politics is the most difficult job in the world. And one way to get round this lack of trust is to talk to the electorate. And also, we need an electorate that's prepared to understand the different trade-offs and the difficulty of it all. And I do get a bit fed up with this. We don't trust politicians. Everybody's sitting back having a consumerist attitude to political life. I think it's unfair on people like you, and I think everybody needs to grow up a bit.
Okay, on that bombshell, let's go to a fun question. It is from Christy in Blackpool. Sarah Jessica Parker has insisted she does read 2 books every day as part of her role as one of the judges for the Booker Prize, but she's struggling to keep up with the demands on her. When have you taken on a challenge which proved a little too big for you? Poppy?
Probably Trying to Watch and Just Like That. Which is the sequel series to Sex and the City, which is a fantastic show, which was getting some disparagement on the panel earlier. But the sequel series is utterly atrocious. All the actors have had so much work done that they can't emote, which is quite a problem. So I can now understand why Sarah Jessica Parker has gone to the book world. I'll put it that way.
Okay, Alec?
Well, I mean, you sort of go from the book world. I mean, I do try and read books, and I have recently been starting to read some of the more classics and very classics, and I have bought Homer and the Iliad. Maybe that could be too much. Maybe that will be the challenge that I give up on.
I thought you were going to say you bought my biography of Margaret Thatcher and struggled
Actually,
with it.
Ian, probably being a West Ham fan probably is something.
Yeah, that's true. Melissa?
Well, you wrote a very short biography.
I did.
Deliberately. I'm going to answer this a bit seriously. Sorry not to be fun. I think it was having 2 children and trying to keep my income up, my work life up and my life up. And I managed it because you always come out the other end. But I think it's something that we still don't talk about enough. Realistically.
Would your children say that you managed it?
They're listening now. So
Tom?
I don't want you to think this is a cop-out, but I kind of think the public don't want politicians to talk about how hard life is for them. We saw election, we got elected, it's our job to deliver, and I don't think that the public want to hear from politicians that are taking tough decisions and how it impacts them.
No, but in your life, what challenges proved too much for you?
What?
Digital detox. Putting my phone down every Sunday and not checking WhatsApp.
That is hard.
Yeah, very hard.
It's necessary, though. It's good for your health.
Well, thank you. You've been a superb panel, as I knew you would be. Tomorrow we have on the panel the former Chief Inspector of Schools. That is Amanda Spielman, Labour MP and Defence Committee Chair Tan Desai, and the Liberal Democrat Home Affairs spokesperson Lisa Smart, and LBC's very own Natasha Clark. Coming up in the next hour, we are going to ask you, when did you get up this morning? That might seem a little bit of a personal question, but according to Nigel Farage, it matters. The Reform UK leader has been speaking to the Telegraph. He says he often starts work at 4 in the morning and doesn't need very much sleep. Farage also states that Reform voters are the same. They're up early, they work hard, they're people who have alarm clocks. But since the pandemic, it's clear the world has changed, hasn't it? Home working, flexible working, remote working. Have many of you thrown your alarm clocks in the bin? Do you really need to get up early to be a productive person? Or is Alarm Clock Britain, as Nick Clegg used to call it, a thing of the past? I got up at 9.
On your radio, on the LBC app, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, the UK could be forced by NATO to commit to a big boost in defence spending. The alliance is thought to be targeting 3.5% of